So in the last video, we discussed user management system. And to develop this user management system, we use a technology stack. What is the technology stack we use to develop this project? Spring Boot, Spring Data JPA, Spring Web, Spring Boot Dev Tool, Lombok, MySQL, Spring Boot Actuator, Build Tools. Now, let me try to start. To understand, before going to develop the application, let's try to understand the architecture once again. This is the best architecture what I'm trying to following now to develop this application. Controller, services, repositories. See now, here dev layer we can try to call as a repository layer, dev layer, persistent layer. Even services we can try to call business layer, service layer. We can try to write business operations. We can perform a business operation. What is the API layer? Controller. So controller capture the data is coming from a client interacting with a service layer. From the service layer interact with taking the help of repository, store the data in the database, and we can try to perform the operations like insertion, updation, deletion, retrieval, and even we can try to perform manipulation. I can say simple word is manipulations on database software. Now, after understanding about this architecture, let's try to understand the to develop a dev layer. What is the technology we are going to use? Spring Data JPA. Using Spring Data JPA, we can interact with the database software to perform manipulations like insertion, updation, deletion, retrieval, operations we can try to perform. Spring Data JPA is a module of the Spring Data framework. It sits on top of JPA and Hibernate and Hibernate. It simplifies the data access layer in Spring application by removing boilerplate code. We don't have to write entity manager code, or most of the code is manually. So what is your Spring Data JPA? Using Spring Data JPA, we can try to perform the operations on database software. And what are the operations you can try to perform? Already I mentioned several times. The same operation, guys: storing, retrieving, updating, and deleting. That's it. Simple. Now, what is the advantages of Spring Data JPA? Before going to look at advantages, first let's try to go for to write. To interact with database software, we require class name, URL, username, password. Let's try to configure database details in .property file. Spring dot data source dot URL. So com dot, look at now. Now, Spring dot data source dot driver class name. What is the class name? Look at now, com.mysql.cj.jdbc.driver. Driver is a class. com.mysql.cj.jdbc is the package name. What is the URL we can try to use? JDBC is the main protocol, and MySQL colon localhost, host indicating IP address, host indicating IP address or host name of a computer, where exactly your database software is running. In this application, database software is running on my system itself. It means the local system itself. We are trying to using local host. Okay. What is the port number? 3306. And you can try to specify user DB. So this is user DB is a database name. Now, and class name URL. Next, class name URL, data source username. What is the username? Root, data source, password. Root, username and password. Next, URL, username, password. What about next one? Minimum we require these four properties are class name, URL, username, and password. Next, string dot, jpa dot, hibernate dot, auto. Data definition language auto property update. If the table is available, it uses a table. If table is not available in the database, it create a table. What is the use of this property, guys? What is the use of this property? Using this property, we can create a table in the database. If the table is not available, if table is available, it uses the table. It uses the table. Okay. Next, jpa.showSQL. True. It means that when we are storing a data in the database, we are using Java object we are storing in the database. Now, when objects are storing, then Java objects cannot understand the database software directly. But how it will be converted? And we can see the queries, SQL queries to display on console. We can try to use show SQL true. Good. Now, so these are database properties are required and server port number. Fine. Class name, URL, username, and password. What is the next step? Let's try to go for to write entity class. Next step is entity class. Right click on this. Right click on this, new a class, com.ms.entity. Now, what is the entity class here? User info. Now, I created one plain Java class. Okay. Now, here we are providing private int. I can say integer user ID, private string first name, private string last name, private first name, last name, email, first name, last name, and email. Next, private string password. And even I want to perform soft delete operation, guys. So let me try to write deleted, then false. So like this. Good. Now Control A, Control F. So here I designed a class. Class inside we specified some properties. Good. So I want to make this class as a entity class. How can I try to make a class as an entity class? We can configure @entity. What we can do that? @entity. So a class we can configure @entity. @entity. So what is entity class? Entity class, a class is configured @entity. We can try to call as a entity class. Entity class. Entity class is mapped with database table. Entity class mapped with database table. Table name. Now user details. You can try to provide any name here. If you not specify the table name, by default, class name only chooses as a table name. Class name only it chooses as a table name. Now, So one of this property we can try to make as a primary key in JPA environment. For that, at the rate of ID. Look at now, at the rate of ID. Here observe that ID. Specify the primary key of an entity. Specify the primary key of an entity. Good. At the rate of generated value. What is the strategy we are trying to apply here? The strategy here we are using identity. What is that? Identity. If you are working with MySQL or PostgreSQL, it chooses identity is a strategy. So automatically, auto incrementation happens the ID into the database software. Let me show you guys. Look at, see, ID, generated value, tells JPA that the primary key value should be auto-generated. Without it, you don't have to manually set the ID before saving. It has strategy parameter that defines how the ID gets generated. How the ID gets generated. See, here we are having different strategies: auto, identity, sequence, auto, identity, sequence, table. So look at now auto. GV picks an appropriate generation strategy depending on the database dialect. Identity, auto increment column in the database. MySQL, SQL Server, like this. Sequence, generally we try to use strategy is a sequence for Oracle, PostgreSQL. Table uses a special table to store and generate IDs, less common now. So nobody is not using nowadays a table. Okay, so I'm using in my project development in MySQL. So if I'm using MySQL, I try to use a strategy name is called identity algorithm. Look at now once. Let me try to go to here. Identity. Look at now identity. Yeah. Control A, Control Shift F. Is it clear? Yes. Now, I believe everyone understand how to write entity class. How to write the entity class. So, with class is configured at the rate of entity, we can try to call as a entity class. Entity class is mapped with a database table. Entity class mapped with database table. Okay, entity class is mapped with database table. Good. Now ID generated value. Good. And now let me try to generate setters and getters. Source, generate getters and setters. Look at now. Save it. Good. All argument based constructor. Right click on this. Source, generate constructor using a field, parameterized constructor. Now right click on this. Source, generate constructor. Observe here we are trying to make as a simple. That's it. Setters and getters and parameterized constructor and default constructor. Right. So this is approach we can try to perform entity class. Look at this. JPA is a ORM, object relational mapping. So what happened here now? Class name mapped with a database table, class properties mapped with a database columns, right? And what is the gap is there between object relational mapping? What is the gap is there between object-oriented environment, relational database environment? That gap we can try to fulfill it. That gap we can try to fulfill using ORM technologies. So guys, ORM frameworks. We have several ORM frameworks available now. Hibernate, Hypernet, IBTs, Toplink, JPA, Spring Data JPA. We can use any one of this framework. We can try to perform the operations like this. Now, I'm working with the Spring Boot, then we are preferable and using Spring Data JPA. Good. I hope everyone understand how to write entity class now. Good. Let's try it. How to write entity class. I believe understand everyone. Once again, look at now. See, ID generator value. ID is the primary key. The database itself will auto-generated. The database itself auto-generate the ID using an auto-incremented column. After you call a repository, and we'll discuss this one in the next video, when to use which MySQL identity auto incrementation purpose. The PostgreSQL we prefer to use sequence or identity. Postgres 10 plus has identity columns also, guys. Oracle sequence, no doubt. If unsure, auto. So I don't know then which algorithm had to be used to perform auto incrementation. In the moment you can try to go for to use auto. Good. Now once again look at here advantages of Spring Data JPA. Well, advantages: less boilerplate code. No need to write entity manager code, and we can try to perform CURD operations. We can try to make to simplify application development. How can we try to simplify? The Spring Data JPA itself is try to provide some predefined methods like save, find all, deleted by ID, find all, find by ID, like this. Powerful query generation, custom queries, pagination and sorting. And all these advantages we are going to look at one by one, developing step-by-step process. Let me stop it here, and next video we are going to do that. We are going to develop repository interface, and we'll understand the Spring Data lifecycle. And after that we will try to understand how to develop service layer and how to write a custom validations and exception handling. All these operations we are going to be develop step-by-step process. Thank you.